California for going on 5 years. Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. And I've been licensed in Arizona for longer than I'd like to admit. So I am a small business attorney. I work with a lot of cannabis businesses and other license types with all sorts of things, licensing, onboarding, regulatory compliance, governing documents, and lots of employment law, more and more over the last year. So I'm really excited to be presenting on this topic again this year. I'm going to hit a lot of the items that I hit last year because they're so critical and important. So that said, let's get going. First off, attorney disclaimer, this is not legal advice. This seminar is for educational and informational purposes. So if you need legal advice specific to your situation, please contact an attorney. Okay, let's go. So human resources for cannabis businesses. The first thing I always like to tell people is it's really not unlike any other small business. There's additional regulatory requirements through the licensing agencies, but all in all, as cannabis is coming into a more acceptable world, it's becoming more and more like any other business, which means lots and lots of labor compliance. So the number one thing I always talk about whenever I'm doing these presentations is the difference between, what is an employer? Who is an employee? Who's not an employee? What I see, unfortunately, all too often is folks trying to skirt around employment classification because it's a nightmare. Employment compliance is not impossible, but when you look at it, it can feel overwhelming. It needs to be broken down piece by piece. And once you get it up and running, it just sort of flows, but it's really important to get it up and running. So who is an employer? The California Labor Code defines an employer as any person who directly or indirectly, through an agent or another person, employs or exercises controls over the wages, hours, or working conditions of another person. So that's a lot of legalese, but essentially, if you're directing somebody's labor, you're probably an employer, and that is as opposed to an independent contractor. There's a lot of misclassifications that happen in California. I see this occurring usually under one of two circumstances. Number one, paying folks under the table, or number two, misclassifying people as independent contractors. Paying folks under the table is just, nobody pays that. You don't pay them on the records at all. They're not paying taxes. You're not paying taxes. There's no record of it. Don't do it. It's patently unlawful, and it can get you in a lot of trouble. The second and more common relationship that I see that I think folks resort to without realizing that it may not be improper is classifying folks as independent contractors. So independent contractors, it's an evolving test under California law. There's actually a few different laws, but the most important and prominent rule I tell folks to really focus on when they're making this general conceptual classification is the ABC test. This was old case law that was in effect in California for some time before it was codified into statute under AB 5, which was passed in late 2019. AB 5 codifies the ABC test of independent contractor status. It's a clear declaration of public policy from California, essentially saying that the state intends to protect workers who are missing out on basic protections of the wage and hour laws in California as a result of this misclassification. There's three major prongs to the ABC test when you're trying to determine if somebody truly can be classified as an independent contractor. The first is control. An independent contractor is free from the control and direction of the hirer that's in performing the work. And this is not just under contract, but also in fact. How are things actually shaking down? I see a lot of folks that come to me and say, oh, but there's a contract and they agreed to be an independent contractor. It's almost useless. It really needs to be, how is the actual working situation working out? Number two, the B, is the business outside of the hirer's normal course. So what that means is that an independent contractor performs work that's outside the scope of the hirer's normal business. So for instance, as cannabis cultivators, if you're hiring somebody to build the outbuilding, your bookkeeper, your accountant, your attorney, folks like that that are engaging in some business that's fundamentally different from your operation, that can be an independent contractor. And then number three is C, which is customarily engaged in an independent trader business. So they have, their own business, their own clients. They're not working for just you. So, I really tell folks, you need to look closely when you're classifying people as independent contractors. You can't just put it in paper and assume that that is going to hold. Another thing I want folks to keep in mind, what I've been seeing a lot over the past year is folks who are trying to work with contractors to run their farms for cultivation businesses by creating contractors agreement, master services agreement, consulting agreements, whatever fancy name you give the contract, that doesn't necessarily dictate whether or not that is a legally appropriate independent contractor classification. More importantly, what I'm seeing, regardless of whether or not the independent contractor test is meeting, is folks aren't reporting these relationships to the DCC. Keep in mind that under the DCC regulations, there's two different prongs to the ownership test. So you've got to report owners to the DCC if they're 20% owners or more, but there's also this management, direct, and controls piece of that test. And almost anytime somebody is working under one of these consulting agreements, or they're running your farm for you, they're going to qualify as an owner. And this includes profit splits. So they're going to need to be disclosed probably as an owner, and at the very least as a financial interest holder. So I'm seeing that missed out a lot. And generally the state, as long as you report it, what you don't want to have happen is they show up at an inspection, somebody's there working that the DCC has never been informed about. So when in doubt, disclose your relationships to the regulatory authorities. I mean, that is something that's a separate component that's different than whether or not they're classified correctly. You definitely don't want to have a regulatory violation just because you failed to do that owner addition. It's a really brief document. Just do it. Okay, so that said, bear with me. Okay, so the independent contractor and employment distinction, this is coming up most often when there's a fallout, when you have a former worker and for whatever reason you've parted ways and they file an unemployment claim, a workers' compensation claim, a lawsuit, a wage claim. Those sorts of disgruntled former laborer claims are what I am seeing most frequently triggering these investigations that can then lead to the EDD, that is the Employment Development Department, wanting to do audits of your books, your records, taking a look at it. Or if somebody files a state disability or a workers' compensation claim, claims discrimination, wage theft claims, all of those things can trigger company-wide audits of your records, and you can get pinged for all sorts of violations outside of just that improper classification. And not only that, but the penalties for improper classification are pretty severe. And these range from a straight up first offense penalty of $5,000 all the way up to $15,000 for willful misclassification. There's shaming involved by the agencies. You can be required to post a notice indicating that you had misclassified workers for a year following that violation. Moreover, the regulatory agencies, it's baked in that if you have an administrative judgment or a court order, an administrative order or a court judgment related to a labor claim, those need to be reported to DCC within 48 hours. And anybody who is operating under an entity, whether that's an LLC or a corporation, you may have noticed that when you're filing your statements of information, there's now a full question on the statement of information asking if you have had any of these judgments or administrative orders against your company for labor violations. They're not messing around. I mean, this is just information that it needs to be disclosed to the agencies. It's showing up on the Secretary of State website, and it can trigger all these investigations. So I always tell folks, wage claims and labor claims, while they're really overwhelming, these are the sorts of things that you just got to contemplate before you're bringing on staff, because getting hit with one of these claims could be a bankrupting event. And again, it's one of those things that feels really overwhelming because there's a lot of little pieces to it. But you can get people to help you onboard employees. And once you're up and running, you're just sort of plugging in information into payroll and getting it going. So it's not worth the risk. Be sure that you are properly compensating your employees and that you're classifying your laborers correctly. One other thing I want to say about contracted labor is that, if you are working with somebody, essentially a farm manager, if you are entering into a contract where somebody is running your farm for you, they need to have an FLC license. That is a farm labor contractor license. You can enter into all of those contracting agreements, consulting agreements, all those sorts of things with companies that have those FLC licenses. That's actually something that makes those relationships completely appropriate. They're also able to operate as a temporary staffing agency for farms. So they can help you avoid a lot of the little detailed things that we're going to jump into in terms of onboarding employees. I also want to mention there is a new change to the law this year. It's effective as of January 1. It is AB 1003. It just went into effect. It essentially makes the intentional theft of wages above $950 for a single employee or $2,350 for two or more employees. that is now classified as grand theft, and that can be prosecuted as a felony. So again, the state of California is just not messing around when it comes to labor claims. As I mentioned before, I used to practice in Arizona, and it is shocking to me when I look at what it takes to comply as an employer in those two different jurisdictions. It's really difficult to check all the boxes in California, which is why it's important to take a comprehensive look at it before you get going into your labor year, because there's a lot of little details. Okay. Okay, the other thing I want to mention, another reason it's really, really important, in addition to all the agencies, looking closely at these things, posting notices online with the Secretary of State when there's violations, yada, 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 is owner liability. Wage claims, including improper misclassification and failure to pay taxes. This is one of those situations where the corporate veil it won't always help you. Anybody who's holding their cultivation license in an LLC, a corporation, some sort of entity, usually when you meet with the attorneys helping you form those entities, you get a speech about the corporate veil and how it creates this protection around the individuals, protects against liability. Unpaid wages is one of those situations where there is a direct sword that just cuts down the corporate veil shield. And even if you are perfectly compliant with your governing documents, owners can still be personally liable for wage claims by workers. So that liability can attach to a person acting on behalf of an employer. That includes owners, directors, officers, managers. So this is a really broad definition under the labor code, and the idea behind it, the policy behind this law, is that if a company goes bankrupt, doesn't have the money to pay the wages, which is oftentimes why they didn't pay the wages, then they can then come after the owners, the managers, the supervisors. So be very, very careful about not paying your workers. That can come after you, even if you close down your entire business. Okay. So one of the other things I want to talk about before we launch into onboarding is that I get a lot of calls here at the office about folks that are overwhelmed with the idea of bringing on employees. And so they're looking for ways around that. How can I get out of paying taxes? How can I minimize my tax liability? How can I minimize the administrative paperwork? And so what I see is folks, the most common thing that I'm seeing over the last year is I get calls about cannabis businesses wanting to grant a labor or some equity interest in the company in the hopes that will allow them to get around the wage and hour requirement. I tell folks you need to be very, very careful about that. While equity can be considered a piece of compensation, that doesn't negate all of the minimum wage rules in California. So under California, you've got to pay people minimum wage. You're supposed to pay them at least twice a month. And giving somebody 1 or 2% of your company, that doesn't mean you don't need to pay them compensation. It's going to be based on the reality of their work for the company and whether or not they're classified as an employee. The other thing is that, again, so that applies to owners as well. Just because you're an owner of the company doesn't necessarily make that owner immune from wage claims against the company. So you need to talk with your tax representative. I'm not a tax attorney. I always refer people I tell people, get with the tax attorney specifically, talk to your CPA. The taxation of owner payments really depends on your entity type and how you're receiving those payments, whether that's through payroll or through an equity distribution. So talk with your tax professional to make sure that's all being reported appropriately so you don't get pinged later. Officers of a corporation. Officers of a corporation are statutory employees, i.e. they need to be paid minimum wage. You have to comply with the rules. So this includes, the president, the vice president, your CEO. I often have people call that say, hey, I want this guy to come work for me. And he wants to be called the chief technology officer, whatever, some officer position, because that can be an attractive incentive to bring on really good employees. Keep in mind, you make somebody an officer, they're automatically a statutory employee. Let's see, interns and trainees. I have people ask me all the time, can I call somebody a trainee? Can I make them an intern to get around reporting them as employees and minimum wage? There's very specific requirements that surround interns and training. Check on your situation. It's almost never inapplicable for general labor. Family employment is another commonly misunderstood area. Even if somebody qualifies for a family exemption in terms of an employee, that doesn't mean you're not paying any taxes. So you still pay the personal income tax. You may not pay unemployment insurance, training tax, state disability. You still have to report them to the EDD. You still have to remit the personal income tax payments. And this only applies to parents, spouses, domestic partners, children under 18. It doesn't apply to everybody that a lot of us would consider family. The other thing, and more importantly, is that there's no way to take advantage of those family exemptions for certain types of tax if you're operating as an LLC or corporation. I just saw a question come in. Can an 18-year-old family member take a role in a non-plant touching role in cultivation manufacturing? That's an interesting question. I think you need to be very careful about that. In California, under the rules, you're supposed to be 21 years old to be working at a cannabis business. So when we say a non-plant touching role in cultivation manufacturing, I would say no, not if that is, for instance, the HR or the paperwork that's being done for the company. So if you hold your permit under the name of 123 Green Farming LLC, and you want to have somebody that's under 18 that's working in a non-plant touching role, but still doing business for that LLC, getting paid by that LLC, they need to be 21. They're a licensee's employee. Okay, let's see. Equity, we hit on that. All right, so now that we've kind of gone over sort of the basics in terms of who's an employee versus a contractor, and workarounds that I see a lot in terms of equity officers, things like that. Employee onboarding. So there's a lot of just sort of employee basics, but the great thing about this is there is a litany of online resources that are available for folks in California. So the first thing that I'm going to link to people, if you're going to hire staff, the place that you should start is read the employment development. Sorry, I just had a pop-up from my computer. The Employment Development Department every year releases an employer's guide. So the 2022 version has now launched. It includes amazing links to the Employment Development Portal, which includes a new employee registry, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's information with payroll tax seminars and lots of other great information for employers. When you're going to hire somebody, a few things, people will often download employee applications online. Be very careful about that. There's very specific limitations in California in terms of what you can and cannot ask when you're hiring. You can't ask for salary history. You can't ask for race, religion, if they have children, what their political leanings are, things like that. Photographs or access to social media. You would be surprised. I have seen employee applications or advertisements that say submit a photograph. It's shocking. Age, you can't ask them how old they are, but you can ask them if they meet the minimum, age requirement for working in a cannabis business, which again is 21 in California under DCC reg. I think it's 15000 something, point something. Anyway, before you hire an employee, there's a few things you need to do on the front end. So the first one of those is that you need to have an employer identification number. That is your federal tax number. Almost everybody is already going to have that because you need to submit that along with your application to the states as well as to the locals. The Employment Development Department, so the EDD, which I just threw into the chat. So anytime, if you hire a laborer, as soon as you pay them more than $100 in wages in a calendar quarter, boom, you need to report them within 15 days to the Employment Development Department. The Employment Development Department is just the California administrative agency that's handling employment issues, payroll reporting, unemployment, things like that in the state of California. When you're going to hire employees, you need to get a state employment identification number. This is something you will not necessarily have just by virtue of submitting your California licenses. It's something that you need to obtain when and if you start paying employees through payroll. The great thing about that is that it's really easy to pull online, and the Employment Development Department, in my experience, is incredibly helpful. You can call them up and they can walk you through these things. So within 15 days of paying wages in excess of $100, you need to register online for an employee payroll tax account, same thing as your EDD number or your state tax number. And then within 20 days, you need to provide the EDD with either a DE-34, that's a report of a new hire, and you're actually supposed to provide them, even if you hire an independent contractor, there's a document, that is the DE-542. And there's continuous filing requirements every quarter. You can file those reports online through the EDD website. And then on January 1st, 31st of every year, W-2s, or for independent contractors, 1099s. Some of the things I tell people, just pro tips, the EDD is really helpful. When you call them up, I've seen them walk people through registering, submitting their quarterly reports, all of that. Don't be nervous about them. They're used to helping small businesses and they're not weirded out by cannabis. The other thing is that a lot of these requirements in terms of signing up for payroll accounting, doing your quarterly reports, remitting all of your taxes, most of the payroll companies, so for instance, there's Paychex, ADP, Intuit, which is a QuickBooks extension. Gusto is one I really like. They're cheap. A lot of those companies, for a really manageable, reasonable fee, will file these online reports for you, including your basic reports of new employees to the EDD. So talk with them. You know, when you're contemplating bringing on staff, call up some of these companies, call up Gusto, call up Intuit, call up ADP or Paychex, and ask them what the difference would be in just the basic payroll versus having them handle all these reportings. And you'll see it's generally a very minor financial difference. So I like it. I've always used it, even though I'm an attorney that practices employment law. I just run it through my payroll reporting company. Okay, when you're hiring somebody, so that's sort of getting started, you know, getting ready to hire folks. Get your ED number, set up your payroll account, link it to your various bank accounts. If you're fortunate enough to have a bank account, you don't need to have a bank account, but it just becomes more complicated in terms of bringing in those tax payments to the various agencies. So once you've decided to hire an employee, you've found somebody, you vibe pretty well together, and then you want to hire them, there's a few different things that you need. So the number one thing that I tell people is start a personnel file. You know, when you know that you're going to bring on staff, the number one thing you need to do is just allocate some space wherever you're keeping your records and things like that for your personnel file. Get a manila folder, a pullout, whatever that looks like for every single one of your employees. And there's a number of documents you've just got to have in there. So the most important document, this should be document number one that I unfortunately see missing all too much, is a document called the Wage and Employment Notice. This is actually required under California law. And the great thing about this notice is it just spells out really clearly to you and the worker, you know, who the actual hirer is, you know, who's the company that's hiring you. Is it the cultivation company? Is it some sort of management company that's providing staff? Whatever that looks like. It lays out what that wage is, how you're getting paid, when you're getting paid, what your start date is. When I have companies call me up and they say, hey, I've got this former worker, you know, he's all mad. He says I owe him X amount of dollars. And I say, well, did you have the 2810.5 form? Because that usually makes it really clear. And that's the whole idea behind this rule, is that it puts everybody on the same page with how a worker is being compensated. So just make sure that you have that. It's oftentimes missing from personnel files, and it's not because it's difficult to fill out or hard to get. I think it's people just don't know that they need to get it. The next thing that you need to have in that personnel file is the employment verification, known as the I-9. I'm throwing links into the chat, by the way, to these documents. This is just a form where the worker is providing appropriate documents, just confirming that they're eligible to work in the United States. That's something that you need to get within, you know, a few days of them beginning work. The employee withholding form, so there's going to be the federal, this is what you or your payroll professional are going to need to calculate withholdings. So you want to get one of these. I tell people to get them every year, just because those documents often change. For instance, the IRS changed how they calculated deductions. I think it was in 2020 or 2021. So just have them update these forms every year. So the W-4 is the federal form, and then the California form is the DE-4. So I just threw all of those into the chat. So those are the important things you're going to need to calculate what their withholdings are going to be. California also has a litany of required pamphlets and postings that you need to give to employees on the beginning of their employment. I always tell folks, don't get overwhelmed with this. There's lots and lots of lists online, you know, the disability, the transgender rights, the workers' compensation, all of these notices that you need to have posted and pamphlets you need to get out. There are really great all-in-one posters available on Amazon that you can get pretty cheaply. And then there's also really good links from the various agencies that talk about the pamphlets that you need to have. So I always tell people, take a look at the Department of Industrial Relations. That's a California agency, and the EDD. They always have great listings of those pamphlet and posting requirements. Oh, I forgot to mention, there is a document that you also have to give to new hires called the time of hire pamphlet. And this just provides them with information regarding the workers' compensation coverage. Workers' compensation coverage is really important to have in California as a cultivator, as any business, because if you have an employee who's injured on the job and you're not carrying the required workers' compensation coverage, then they can file a lawsuit against the employer for that injury to recover, the pain and suffer, all the various, fallouts of being injured. And employers presumed to be negligent in relation to that injury. So just make sure that you have that appropriate workers' compensation insurance in place, and that you're handing out that time of hire pamphlet, which allows the employees to know who your carrier is, how they report the claims, on and on and on. So all of that said, I just want to kind of back up and globally talk about, it feels really overwhelming, the hiring and getting payroll started in terms of the pamphlets I need to have, the paperwork I need to have, the taxes I need to remit, getting that all set up. It feels like a lot. It's usually something that you can handle, sitting down for 48 hours or hiring an HR professional to just knock it out for you in one swoop. One thing I tell people is that you can expect, if you're paying somebody $14, $15 an hour, $14 an hour is the minimum wage for businesses with under 25 employees as of January 1. Calculate what your payroll is going to be. If you've got $1,000 a week and what you're paying out to workers and payroll, anticipate a markup of somewhere between 20 and 30% for the various taxes and the workers' compensation. I am hearing the workers' compensation premiums are going down a little bit. I was hearing as high as $10 for every $100 of payroll initially when it launched here in California, the cannabis regulatory system. But I think they're seeing that the injury rate isn't as high as they thought it might be. Cultivation is not inherently dangerous. So I'm hearing that's going down. So generally expect that if you've got $10,000 worth of wages, that's probably going to cost you $13,000 to $14,000 total. Let's see. The last link is broken. It needs an F at the end. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I will resend that link. Okay, so just again, a lot of these issues too, in terms of that initial paperwork and hiring, that can be handled by your payroll service provider. A lot of these payroll processing companies now will send an onboarding link to your workers where they upload their I-9, they upload their W-4, and it all feels like a lot, but it's all front loaded, and it can all be done with the assistance of processing companies and HR professionals pretty cheaply. You don't need to hire an attorney to help you set up payroll or get it going. My understanding is Rolling Hills helps out with things like this. There's lots of online companies. So just sort of look into it, get price quotes. And I think you'll see that it's not as difficult or overwhelming as folks think it is. It's really, the biggest issue is just having to pay those costs as you go along. And I understand that that's difficult. It's hard to calculate and pay folks, particularly in an industry that historically was paying people at the end of the season based on a percentage. And it's really hard to have those resources and pay people as you go along the year. But the risks are so significant that you've got to be budgeting for it and accounting for that now, before you're going into your season, and really thinking about that, because these wage claims can ruin your business. It can legitimately bankrupt your business, on top of the fact that the agencies, and not just the DCC, the EDD, the Labor Commissioner, all of these agencies will come at you for this stuff. So it's just really important to be thinking about labor costs and considering that one of those mandatory things. It really is something that needs to be on the front end of your considerations and in your budget each year. Okay, so we've sort of talked about the documents that you need to have in the personnel folder. Another thing to keep in mind is that the law in California just increased the amount of time that you need to hold on to all those documents. It's 4 years from the date of hire or any employment action. I tell people, hold on to all of your employment records for 5 years after you part ways with the employee. And if you're on notice that there's some sort of wage claim, potential litigation, just hold on to it until you have a chance to talk to an attorney. Okay, so let's see. Once you've got folks working for you, what do you have to do? There is, California cultivation employees are not considered they're not classified as agriculture workers from a wage and hour perspective. So they're actually covered. Let me back up. California has these various industries that dictate hours of work before overtime kicks in, rest breaks, meal breaks, lodging credits, all those sorts of things. I think there's something like 14 of them. California cultivators are covered under Wage Order 4-2001, which I'm linking in the chat. Please read this before you have an employee. This is also required to be posted. And so the unfortunate thing about Wage Order 4-2001 in a cannabis cultivation context is this is the wage order that covers professional, technical, clerical, mechanical employees or similar occupations, which feels counterintuitive because there's an entire wage order devoted to agriculture. And for lots of reasons we won't jump into right now, California opted not to put cultivation workers there. So what that means is that you don't have the traditional additional allowances for overtime and things like that. So California workers at a cultivation site, it's an 8-hour day and then you move into overtime territory. So there are various exemptions from the overtime requirements. Those are covered in that wage order. They're very rarely coming into play on cultivation properties, except for perhaps the executive exemption, that's somebody who's managing. The main thing to keep in mind for folks that are falling under an overtime exemption is that they need to be getting paid 2 times the minimum wage for a 40-hour week. So again, minimum wage is now $14 an hour for folks with under 25 employees. That's working out to about $5,200 a month. If you're not paying somebody at least that much every single month, then they're not exempt from overtime. So just keep that calculation in your brain. Overtime is a really big source of litigation, and I'm going to get into at the end of this presentation where I'm seeing issues come up and trends that I think are occurring right now in the cannabis industry. But just keep in mind, overtime is a really big source of potential disputes, litigations, and wage claim. Take a look again, Wage Order 4-2001 will lay out the exemptions, when you can get around the overtime properly. And then it also, again, goes through minimum wage, meal and rest breaks. Just quickly, meal and rest breaks, you've got to give employees 10 minutes where they're completely free from your control for every 4 hours. And ideally that should be occurring in the middle of that shift. You need to pay them for this time. So just because somebody's clocking out for 10 or 15 minutes for their break, you still need to pay them. That's part of their compensated time. Meal periods, you have to give employees 30 minutes time off if they are working before their 5th hour. They can waive this. They can waive this if they're working less than 6 hours and you have a written meal period waiver on file. You can't just do it if they decide to take a short day. So that meal period, it can be unpaid, but again, it needs to be free from the employer's control. So you can't have them on call, you can't have them watching the door, things like that. They need to be able to just completely mentally check out. Let's see, I've got, there's a comment in the chat about discussion at the state level of moving cannabis cultivation employees to the ag wage order. There's always ongoing discussions about reclassifying cannabis as an agriculture activity for various reasons, not just for the wage and hour rules, but also in relation to the various requirements that are applying to you folks when you're onboarding into the cannabis system. One of the big things that's happening to cultivators is they're getting hit with these really gnarly road improvement rules, fire standards, things like that. All a direct result of not being classified as agriculture. My personal opinion is a lot of it has to do with the state trying to get around right to farm rules. So it's an ongoing policy issue that the cannabis advocacy groups are constantly logged into. It's an uphill battle, but absolutely, there's always conversation on a larger sort of beyond employment law. I think the general sense is that if we could be characterized as what we are, which is agriculture, that it would make everybody's life so much easier. So yes, absolutely, it's important, and it is a massive issue that goes to every aspect of being a cannabis business. Okay, so meal, rest periods, overtime. There's lots of other, little things that have to do with paid sick leave, tools of the trade, uniforms. I'm not going to get into that all today. Just keep in mind that anytime you require them to have tools, if you're requiring them to wear a uniform, all those sorts of things, just check and check that wage order, give it a goog, just really look into what you can and can't force employees to do without compensating them for it. Okay, one thing I do want to talk about quickly though has to do with bonuses. I see a lot of wage arrangements where people are, giving an employee minimum wage just to meet these requirements of wage and hour throughout the year, with some sort of bonus come harvest when the money is coming in. And just be very careful about how that's about how you are structuring those bonuses. You know, if this is a guaranteed bonus, so it's sort of earned along the way, or it's based on commission or piece rate, all those sorts of forms of compensation are earned along the way, which means that if those folks are terminated, quit, leave, you know, before the end of the season, you may still be on the hook for owing them that money. Not only that, but when you're calculating the overtime, those other forms of earned compensation, like guaranteed bonuses, piece rates, that's all supposed to get calculated into the time and a half model for overtime. And it can get really messy. So talk with an attorney or your H&R professional about the different sorts of bonuses, guaranteed bonuses, earned bonuses, discretionary bonuses, and make sure that this arrangement is something that works for you. And again, it's documented and everybody knows what the deal is. Okay, let's see, we're at 4:45. So I'm not going to get too deep into things. Quickly, record keeping. You should all have timesheets where the employee's filling them out. And, you know, I always tell people, pro tip, best practice, you should have a timesheet where everybody's logging their hours every day. There's a section for notes. They sign it. They're confirming that they took their meal and rest breaks, that they've reported all of their hours. So if they come back later and say, I didn't get meal and rest breaks, she's like, what do you mean? Here's your timesheet where you said that, you know, you took your breaks. There's a section for comments, nothing's there. Documentation is really important. The employer is required to document hours, time, all of these things. If you don't have that documentation, they're going to default leave the employee because the record keeping requirements are on the employer. So just put things in writing, have them fill out timesheets, have them report their hours. You know, I see a lot of folks like, well, he texted me his hours for the week. I want to see a timesheet where people are logging in, logging off. It shows their meal breaks, confirming they've taken their rest breaks. Real important. Okay, parting ways. Firing. If you're going to let somebody go, you know, the number one thing is that you can fire somebody. California's at will, unless you have some sort of contract where you're granting them some sort of, you know, what I call progressive discipline, where they have to get warning, second warning, third warning, and then they can be. California's at will. You can fire somebody for any reason, as long as it's not an illegal reason. You know, illegal reasons are going to be, you know, based on gender, discrimination, disability, all those sorts of illegal protected reasons. So it's at will. So if you know you're going to let somebody go, it's just not working out, work is slowing down, follow the policies of your company. So if you have an employee handbook, make sure that you're following whatever you've written in the employee handbook. And if you don't have an employee handbook, you can just, you know, you can let them go. You need to pay them all of their wages, have their final paycheck ready. When you terminate them that day, final paycheck, which includes all accrued all vacation pay. If they're quitting, if you know that they're going to leave and they've given you some notice, at least 72 hours, you need to pay them on the last day. If they just quit on the spot, no notice, you need to pay them within 3 days. The employer is responsible for getting those final wages to the employees, even if they disappear. So if the employee just bounces, you know, offer to mail them their check with tracking, and get something in writing, send a follow-up text, an email, a letter. If an employee goes MIA, you're supposed to remit those wages to the labor commissioners, the unpaid wage fund. So just again, it's on you to pay folks. And if they disappear, then you need to make sure that you're handling those wages correctly. Okay, and I want to close with disputes and just sort of some real, like what I'm seeing, how things are shaking down in practice. So again, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, California wage and hour law is incredibly complicated. It's always changing. It's tough to perfectly comply with. So the number one thing is just be a good boss, you know, be a good human. If you've agreed to bring somebody on to do labor for you, you know, pay them as you've agreed, communicate with them, be respectful. The number one thing is just like, you know, under the traditional market, it was just like, be a good neighbor, be a good boss. You know, particularly in areas like Nevada County, we're a small town. Word gets out. If you're running through employees like gas, I mean, your reputation is going to be known. The number one source of disputes is hurt feelings and a sense of disrespect. So if you're parting ways with a laborer and they feel like you've shorted them, you've robbed them, you're defaming them, disrespecting them, that's the number one thing that triggers folks to go talk to a lawyer, file a wage claim. You know, people get really upset when they feel personally offended. So try to part ways with people on good terms. That's not always possible, but when possible, just be nice, be the bigger person, take the high ground. Be very careful, that when you're having disputes with workers, be careful what you put in a text. Be careful what you put in an email. I tell people, if you're going to write an email, just assume that that's going to be an exhibit to a lawsuit or a deposition or a wage claim. It is shocking what people will put in writing sometimes. So again, just try to stay level-headed. If you need to, step back, have another member of the team handle the parting of the ways, the final paycheck. Even if somebody has stolen from you, broken your stuff, and you still need to pay them their wages. So just be nice, pay them what you owe them, and try to part ways in a friendly manner. And you'd be shocked at how far that goes for people to just, let things go and move on with their life. The other thing I want to say is that what I am seeing happen more and more frequently, in addition to just wage claims, is a lot of these disputes are starting off with just founders disputes. So people who were business partners, people who came together and said, we're going to be a team. There's going to be 4 or 5 of us. We're all going to work together. One of them gets locked out of the company or gets upset and bounces. And the next thing you know, they're filing a lawsuit claiming not just breach of contract, breach of partnership, all of those claims. They'll also include generally some sort of unpaid wage claims. So they're like, either I'm an owner or I'm an unpaid employee. And those things are getting all thrown in with the kitchen sink approach. So again, it's just really important to have your deals with folks documented, whether that's an employment contract, whether that is your governing documents, shareholders agreements, operating agreements, executive compensation, consulting agreements. Have it all in writing, have it buttoned up so that if there's a dispute, everybody knows the rules of engagement. I always tell my clients, if you want peace, prepare for war. Treat it like a prenup. Put all of your agreements in writing when you're all getting along. Okay, so those are the main things. Just be a good human, put things in writing, try to take the high ground. When people are popping off on you, try to disengage and not get emotional about it. The nicer you are, the less likely you are to face one of these claims. Because in California, these wage claims, just Google wage and hour attorney in California. You'll see it's like 1-800 sue my boss. These claims are easy for folks to pursue because there's almost always something you can get people on. So with that, it is 4:50. I'm going to close this out and open us up for questions.
That's so much great information. Thank you, Sarah. I just want to reiterate to people, this is being recorded, and also all of the links she's posted here, I've reposted in the Alliance Slack in the Business Development Skills channel. And I want to really encourage all of you, you can raise your hand if you want to ask questions out loud. Please participate in the discussion. One of the things I also just want to reiterate is that what Sarah said about just like who you are as an employer, it's part of your business's story, really, that you're telling. It's part of who you are putting out, like the type of business that you're putting into the public and talking about to the public. And that is, in the years that we are in these days, it is really a make it or break it, can be a make it or break it thing for the reputation of not just you as the employer, but your whole company. And we all know examples of companies that are touted as being amazing employers that, that really take care of their employees, and just it always reflects back on the whole of whatever business or company that is. And so really, just take that to heart, truly. It's not just that we live in a small community here, but just for the longevity of the farm and the company that you are creating, that is, it is part of that identity. It is part of the story that you want to market, as to who your farm is and what your ethics and sort of moral standings are. That all really, really reflects in the type of employer that is.
Yeah. It's so true, and word gets out, people talk. We're a very small community. It's amazing how you hear sort of the same folks come up time and time again in terms of like, oh, just don't work with them. It's a bad vibe. But it works the other way around too. You do really well at somebody's business and then things slow down. You need to lay them off, whatever that looks like. People will refer, particularly in the cannabis realm. It's such a small community. Personal references those go further than almost anything else, you know, and it's good practice. Like treat your workers, you know, like you would your friends and your family, you know, because you're spending just as much time with those people as you usually are your friends and your family. Treat them accordingly, give them respect and care about them. Like it's going to make your business better and it's going to make them more productive.
Absolutely. If anybody on watching the webinar has questions, please feel free to either raise your hand if you want to speak. You can type your questions into the chat or to Q&A. We here at the Alliance have had a number of our industry affairs member calls with Sarah about employment, being an employer, being an employee. If people also, I'll just mention, we have recordings of calls that really dive with Sarah that dive deep into FLCs, farm labor contract. If people are not intending to be hiring themselves, but they want to hire through an FLC, there is one located in Nevada County that can help you and help you get the workers that you need. Definitely check in here at the Alliance for more information about that, if that is something that would work for your farm operation.
Yeah, quickly, FLCs are effectively a temporary staffing agency. So you can pay the FLC a flat rate. It's usually a pretty small markup from what I'm seeing in the cannabis space. And then they take care of all your tax remittance, workers' compensation, all that jazz. It's a really nice way, particularly if you're just going to have short-term like harvest employees and you don't need somebody there all year to justify setting up all of these, you know, your own EDD account, things like that. It may make sense to just pay a couple extra bucks an hour and let the FLC handle it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So definitely take that into note. We have a ton of more information about that and connect folks with those agencies if they're interested in that. If anybody has other questions, now is a great opportunity or just want to add anything to the conversation. Sarah, her contact information is available on the Alliance website. You can throw that into the chat here, Sarah. I will also post that onto Slack. And just know these are, you know, it might sound overwhelming, but these are just sort of your run-of-the-mill things actually for running a business. And they're very important. And so we are always available to answer questions as they come up as you go into this process. I know some of you are in the process of building your sort of, you know, binders of all compliance things and HR related things. And all of the forms and documents that Sarah's mentioned here, I've linked into Slack, and are key, as she mentioned, to have, you know, your employee binders and just all of that information together in just an easy to locate place that is sort of a one and done. And really, once you get this all set up the first time, you know, it's pretty, am I correct in saying that, Sarah? It kind of flows after you get
it kind of chugs along. I mean, you'll want to check it out usually around the first of every year. I tell folks, you know, just do a quick check, see about updated rules, get the updated W-4s. You know, you want to devote a day to it at the beginning of every year, but kind of once you got it going, it'll just flow throughout the year, particularly with a really good payroll processing company. And shout out to Rolling Hills. I believe that they provide these services as well.
Awesome. And their contact information is also available on the Alliance website. With that, if there are no questions further, I will give everybody their afternoon back. Thank you so much, Sarah. It is great and such important information for folks. Again, this is recorded and will be available. I'll post that on Slack. It's also available on the Alliance website. Thank you, says the chat comments. And we will continue these webinars. Please reach out if there are topics or, you know, subject areas that are of interest to you or important to you that you still have questions of. That's what we're here for. And please stay tuned for some upcoming important policy meetings, local policy meetings, the Compassion meeting, and other things, all Nevada County Cannabis and Alliance related. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their week, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, everybody.